The storms on Keeler 9 did not rive or depart. They simply existed like the bald rock and the shallow gravity and the man who had chosen both. Because they did not ask anything of him. Captain Yelen Reese woke to their static. He lay still for a breath, counting the pulses through the bunker wall's electrical discharges that rippled through the bedrock, and turned his teeth metallic. On better mornings, he could pretend it was rain on a rooftop, an old earth sound, something harmless and domestic. Today it was needles. Today it reminded him of a drill instructor slapping a baton along a row of lockers. He sat up and killed the dream with movement. Boots, seals, the familiar click of his recycler's latch. Coffee, if the black solvent that pulsed through the filter could be called coffee. He drank it anyway and stood at the viewport, the transparent slab that showed a slice of the plain outside. Keeler 9's light was not quite day, not quite night, a kind of permanent bruise. The horizon was a low ridge of pumice, a line too clean to be natural. The guard had bored into this moon once for fuel salts, then abandoned the shafts when the war yawned open elsewhere. Yelen had taken one of the old stations and dragged it out into a habitable shape, habitable for a man who had decided not to be one anymore. He kept the bunker as tidy as a hangar deck. Order calmed the brain. A row of tools burned dull in their clamps. The wall screens slept. Maps, radio spectrums, a weather model he knew was wrong, but checked anyway. As if it might admit its lie and give him a blue day. There were 3 rules to exile. First, maintain your seals. An unsealed man died here in under a minute, lungs floured with ice. Second, never borrow from tomorrow. Rations were mathematics, not hope. Third, avoid the company of your own voice. Yelen had not recorded a voice log in 61 days. He ate a bar of protein that tasted faintly of copper and repaired a loosened baffle on the air scrubber. He knew every bolt in the bunker by touch now. There was comfort in returning things to function. It meant he still believed in cause and effect. He re-greased the wine spool on the external weather mast. Even though the mast was designed to be frictionless, he did it because the ritual mattered more than the physics. He had time for rituals. The guard had stripped him of rank and ship and sent him here for disobeying a direct order. The words of the tribunal were hard and cold enough to build with, a willful dereliction in the theater of battle. He could recite them without hearing them, only in the small hours. When the storms thinned to a distant purr, did the other words, the ones he had chosen, return. We do not fire on civilians. The phrase had been a scrap of resistance that somehow made it through the flood of later events. Evacuation, the CO's scream over the link, the court-martial with its chiseled faces and fixed outcome. He had not changed the war. He had simply changed his place in it. He kept a broken drone on the workbench, a little scout sphere with a cracked optical dome. He could have healed it with a patch and one good solder line, but he did not. He liked it where it was, a failure made visible. Some days he spoke to it in his head, and some days he did not. He never gave it back its voice. The day's tasking went on the board in neat text. Map the new fissure to the south. Harvest ice from the 3rd culvert. Check the outer triangulation beacons. Yelen pulled a suit from the rack. He took one step toward the airlock and stopped. Tiny, almost beneath his hearing. The bunker's long-range band whispered. He felt it more than heard it, another kind of storm beneath the storm. A tremor on a channel that should have been quiet. He set the ice saw down and crossed to the comms shelf. A filament of green crept along the spectrum display. Not meteor chatter, not Keeler 9's usual magnetic songs. Something structured, pulse-spaced. Dead lanes could play tricks, radio ghosts. War debris winking its last codes across space, but this had a rhythm. The machine knew it too. An indicator blinked and text crawled. He leaned in. The gaps were not random. His tongue found a number in the timing. 5. Show me the source. The screen drew a line across vacuum, a thin line that bent around Keeler 9's bulk and terminated in the far hemisphere, high, moving, converging. The storm's static mauled the signal, but the pattern persisted. Heat touched his spine. He tied the band to the old dish on the roof and smoothed the reception. The dish answered with a judder that shook dust from the ceiling beam. Now the whisper became an argument between carrier waves and weather. Beneath it, the machine decoded what it could. The stress, vector decay, non-military. He sat without meaning to. His hand found his hair and came away dusty. 5. He watched their trajectories appear as faint cursors. Speed bled from them to fast. If they were running, they were wounded. If they were seeking him, they had somehow found the only man on this rock who had decided never to answer a call again. He should do nothing. He had built a life out of nothing. Silence had edges he could feel now, edges that could cut him if he moved wrong. He knew the old calculus, respond to a distress in the fringe, and you cut your own beacon in the water. Sharks arrive. He stood anyway. He crossed the bunker and opened the weapons locker. The rifle felt heavier than it had a year ago. Gravity on Keeler 9 was gentler than standard. Your steps had to be relearned. But the weight was in his arm, not his environment. He checked the slide, the charge, the barrel. He snapped a thermal cloak into a roll and stowed it against his pack. He clipped a line of anchor spikes to the belt, steel darts with monofilament leashes that could keep a man attached to the ground when the winds tried to carry him away. He sealed the suit and stepped into the airlock. The inner door whispered shut. He watched the external feed while the pressure bled. A gray field. The fat pulse of dust across the lens. The thin shadow of the weather mast describing its pendulum arc. 5 cursors on the top right corner marked the approach. One wobbled. One spun. He had names for his tools because it helped in the quiet. The magnetometer was the old man. The spectrum analyzer was a cat's ear. The small half-functional drill was a mule, slow and stubborn and unbreakable. He did not name the rifle. Outside, the wind met him with the iron smell of rock sashed into iron soup. The low gravity made every step a long glissade, and the spikes sang as they bit and tethered. Silver leash lines stiff as wire. He kept his head down and followed the bracket he had plotted on his wrist map. A southern line to the Fisher's Lip. Then west to the rim road the miners had cut into the basalt. Then north along the curve toward the old floodplain, a relatively flat landing. If you were desperate or out of options, the world narrowed to gray and motion. The suit's external pickups processed the storm into a set of tolerable frequencies. But it was still like walking inside a throat the size of a continent. He thought of the tribunal room again without invitation. The slow ceiling fan. The shimmer of heat that made the faces swim. The white lines of the uniforms like chalk on slate. He forced the image away by naming rocks. Pillar, hook, jaw. A man survives by building maps, even if they are only made of words. He reached the basalt road. The fill was jagged, blue-black and slick. On the horizon ahead, the storm resolved into its machine parts, writhing curtains like muscle fibers. Luminous threads of charge that leaped from ground to cloud and back, stitched together in knots that tightened and came undone. The winds had scoured any loose sand away. Only the bedrock remained, etched with old gouges where the miners had dragged their rigs. His wrist map pulsed. He sheltered behind a brace of fallen pylons and lifted the visor's magnification. They came down like birds with broken wings. One craft was already missing an engine wrapper, its nutshell coughing bright fragments as it tried to stabilize. The ships were small, barely larger than armored shuttles, but their geometry was all wrong for the guard or any of the known merchant houses. No flat plates, no angles meant to deflect fire. They were curved, latticed, as if spun from glass that had remembered how to grow. Their skins shimmered even in the storm's dim light. A scale effect, a field moving over a field. Yulin watched the formation slip, Reiko here, slip again. Whoever flew them knew discipline. For a breath he saw them as the cadets he had trained once, breaths steaming, arms trembling as they held formation under crosswind drills. He tasted old pride and let it dissolve. The whisper on the comms sharpened. He swept bands, chased the carrier, let the computer guess at compression. It fed him scraps. Impact in, systems offline. Request, any civilian, any guard asset. That last phrase snapped a wire in him. Guard asset. That was what he had been, once an asset, like a fuel depot or a gun. Packaged capability. He angled the antenna for a better catch. There it was, beneath the official tone, another thread, not encrypted, old tech. A ship-to-ship channel, not meant for outsiders. 5 voices layered themselves into a braid, too fast to catch, full of low clicks he had never heard in human throats. The language did not match anything in his training matrices. He felt a strange shame rise in him for the limitation. The first craft kissed the plane to hard, rebounded, corrected, skidded to a halt in a long spray of glassy dust. The second landed clean, short jets firing to pin it against the pull of the storm. The third flared late, struck one of the plane's hidden ridges, corkscrewed, and smeared itself into a field of shrapnel and light. He flinched. The fourth and fifth stacked themselves near the second, neat as eggs in a nest. The distance between him and the ships was less than 2 clicks now. He could see figures moving in the flurry, shapes unsealed. That was either bravery or unatomy that laughed at Keeler 9's air. He thought of lungs like nets and dispatched the image. The old road dipped toward the plane. He did not move. He told himself it was because he was calculating wind vectors, approach in the shadow of the ridge, escape routes back to the bunker if all of this proved to be the opening act of an ambush. That was all true, but beneath it was another truth. He was listening for his own voice to return. The one that had said, "We do not fire on civilians," had often been followed by, "We do not leave them either." A small chime sounded, unnatural amidst the storm's constant noise. He looked down at his wrist. A new return had bled onto the screen, weaker. Behind the curve of Keeler 9's horizon, a second group, slinked low, running dark, its engines masked until they could not be masked anymore. He tapped the display to confirm he was not seeing his ghosts. Range, too far to be an escort. Velocity, too controlled to be debris. Vector, converging not for rescue but interception. He swore once, silently. The sharks had smelled it after all. He slid down from the pylons and moved into the notch that led toward the plane, letting his weight drop to drive the spikes into the loosened soil when the wind shouldered him. He cut the rifle's safety and felt the pre-charge hum. Closer now. The storm pared away between gusts, as if remembering a time when it had a loud sight. The ships up close were even stranger. Their hulls had a grain to them, like wood or living bone. They did not carry guard codes, or any codes he recognized. Only the repeating 5-note signature that pulsed along the spectrum could have been coincidence, but wasn't. He felt the number everywhere now that he had noticed it. 5 landing struts to a ship, 5 bands in the thermal exhaust, 5 figures moving between craft, small against the belly of the storm, but not fragile. The way they moved was not military exactly, but practiced. Raid. They had weapons out, not guard rifles. Something lighter, their stocks semi-transparent, emerald inside with a honeycomb of points that winked and dimmed. He could not see faces through his magnification. He could not read intention. He clicked his external lights twice, the old open channel sign of no harm intended. No one shot him. That was how allegiances began once. He set the rifle's muzzle toward the ground and lifted his hand just above shoulder height. Palm out. He felt ridiculous and ancient, and also like he was about to step back into a life he had buried in under a meter of dust and stubbornness. The wind pressed his suit and found every seam with icy fingers. He took another step, close enough now that he could see inscriptions on the near ship's hull lines etched shallow. Not letters or symbols he knew, something like the edge of waves recorded with a stylus. The nearest figure turned. It was taller than he was by a head, lithe in a way that made him think of archers in tapestries. The visor, if it was a visor, scattered light in a thin halo round the face. It raised its long weapon slowly, kept it trained in the dust just to his left, as if acknowledging his offered courtesy with one of its own. "We can kill you, but we are not doing it yet." His calm's band hiccuped again. For a breath the open channel aligned with one of the ship-to-ship threads. The sound that came through was not quite speech, and not quite song, but held an insistence that made him think of the way pilots talk when the ground is coming up too fast, and there are not enough hands for both the stick and the gauges. 5 voices, braided above them, at the lip of the sky. The second group's engine masks failed entirely. Distant points flared, resolved into signatures. Yulin saw the shape of their drives and the way the exhaust flared unevenly when pushed hard. He did not have to be told what they were. He had hunted with ships like that once. Light, wrong side of legal, their hulls crudely blank to dodge civilian radars. Raiders, or worse. He looked back to the figures by the curving ships. In the storm's lull he heard something like a tone. A single bright thread of sound that pricked the air and suggested, suddenly, a kind of terrible, fragile order you could hang a life from. It came from the nearest figure. It was not meant for him, and yet it found him. It was not a plea. It was not thanks. It was a mark in the air, a stake driven, a promise made. Yelen felt the pressure of silence in his chest give way with a small internal sound. Not breaking, exactly, more like an old joint deciding to flex again. He lifted the rifle, not to aim, but to point up, over their heads, toward the horizon, and the new flares coming in hard. He traced a line with the barrel to show the path. The nearest figure's head tilted, the visor splintering the dim into pieces. The weapon it held came up a degree. He could not see eyes, but he knew attention when it settled on him. He felt for the external speaker switch and thumbed it on. "Company," he said, and his voice sounded like sand dragged across the bottom of a tin. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder to beat the storm. "Company," Yelen repeated, and the word left his mouth like a thing he had not known he still owned. The figures turned as one. The 5 ships seemed to gather themselves. Behind him, very far away and getting closer. The sharks lit their knives. Yelen anchored a spike, clipped his line to it, and took up a position without asking permission from anyone, not the storm, not the strangers, not the ghosts who had sent him here. He had been a soldier for a long time. He had been a man in silence longer. Each demanded a different courage. He didn't know which one he would need in the next minute. He knew only that the minute would come and that he would be inside it when it arrived. The storm opened its mouth and roared. The horizon burned. The number 5 ticked in the bones of the world like a metronom. The silence ended. They did not answer his warning with words. The nearest figure, tall, bow-shouldered, a filigree of iridescence veiled across the faceplate, lifted one hand and drew 5 quick arcs in the air with 2 fingers, a sign as clean as mathematics. 5 incoming. 5 here. Elian nodded once and pointed to the ridged teeth that half-rimmed the plane. He sketched with his free hand a chevron windward, a shallow bowl leeward, a line of advance that would force the raiders to descend into crossfire. The figure turned and flashed the same shapes into space with a tiny projector on her wrist. The other 4 glanced up, aligned in an instant that felt rehearsed. The raiders dropped their masks at range and came in screaming, not with sound, but with leaked heat and sharp drive signatures, the way scavenger craft do when they want fear more than surprise. Ugly hulls, slabs of patched ceramic and buckled metal, plates riveted at bad angles. Gun pods hung like disease. Yelen had hunted in ships like those. He knew where their pride made them sloppy and where their poverty made them mean. He anchored a spike at the ridge and clipped himself in, then slid his rifle along the basalt to its brace. The widows spaced themselves without taking their eyes off the sky, 5 points of a pentagon. Weapons held low, the storm turning their silhouettes into smudges and sparks. Close enough now, Yelen could see that their weapons were not exactly rifles. The stocks were translucent like cooled resin. Along their spines ran a honeycomb of dim, slow embers that brightened when the wielders breathed differently. The barrels were not barrels at all, but prismatic throats. Break them before they break the ground, Yelen said, knowing they couldn't understand the words and saying them anyway. He pinged the ridge with a directional burst from his suit comms 3 tones, then 2, aim high. Then Reka Cadet's signal he hadn't used in a decade. The nearest widow's head cocked. She echoed the tones back, refined and glass-bright, and the 5 of them lifted their knot rifles in a single smooth motion. The first raider flared to lower her nose and deliver stutter fire. Yelen shot the intake right of center, not to kill but to make the pilot correct. The ship skidded sideways, belly scraped by Keeler 9's wind, and the widows fired. Light behaved wrong. Their shots did not lance but unfolded. 5 gossamer sheets that met in the air and knotted into a spear so narrow he could barely see it. Where it touched the raider's port spar, metal blistered like wax. The ship rolled, tried to correct, failed, and folded itself into the storm with a soundless convulsion. Again, Yelen breathed. To them or to himself. Another raider skimmed the ridge to close. Yelen slammed a spike into the basalt and flicked his wrist. A hair-thin monofilament line snapped across the approach. In this gravity the pilot misjudged, tried to bank, and the filament kissed the undercarriage with a tiny silver grin. The ship didn't slice into this wasn't a spacer's myth, but it sheared off a gun pod and sent the craft into a wobble so violent its own inertial dampeners turned against it. The Widow's joined fire took the rest. The third raider learned from the first two and came in high, engine screaming plasma into the storm. The fourth and fifth split, opposite sides, trying to bracket. Yulin felt the bite of calculation return angles and rates, the old grid dropping over the chaos and rendering it solvable. He toggled his external speaker. "Ground your shots," he told the Widows, and dragged his gloved hand down, palm facing the soil, a pilot's sign for bleed. He leaned back and slammed his palm against the basalt. Lightning didn't answer men, but men could answer lightning. The ridgeline was a ladder for charge, and the storm was ready to climb. The 5 aliens heard the word, if not the meaning. The honeycomb along their weapons' spines brightened in response. Taking on a huge Yulin's eyes didn't have a name for. Their next volley left trails that curled downward like rain. When the 5 arcs met the basalt just ahead of the bracketing raiders, the ground woke. A sheet of coruscating light jumped up from Keeler 9 itself, as if the moon had decided to stand. It hit both ships in their bellies. Both engines coughed, then choked. One pilot got clear. The other ate the plane. The last raider ran for it. To the Widow's credit, they didn't chase as if they knew what every soldier learns. Fear can be more useful than a wreck. They lowered their weapons as one. The storm swept back the debris it had tossed. Yulin waited for the second wave that often came on the heels of the first. Nothing. The survivors were content to tell someone what they had found. He would have been, to doubt only when the sky turned back into its normal. Endless argument with itself did he stand unclip and come down toward the plane. Up close, the aliens reconfigured from smudges into individuals. The tall one who had answered his tones came forward. She was silver-skinned, not like metal but like fish at night, an inner pallor that caught wavelengths and returned them indecisively. Where a human would have had hair, she wore a halo of interwoven filaments that moved with neither wind nor gravity. Her eyes were prisms made into irises, colors sliding along edges inside them. When she spoke, the sounds had layers, a main line pitched to his hearing and to faint counterlines he registered. More in his bones than in his ear. "Aid," she said, then stopped, frustrated, and tapped her throat. From her wrist, a small field bloomed, a globe of faint mauve in which characters no letters he knew skipped and reassembled, collapsing into something his translator could attempt. Julen's suit obliged with a beep that sounded embarrassed at its own haste. "Your warning." The translator tried. "We took it." He lifted a hand, palm outward. "You landed like cadets with scars," he said, "and you shoot like a choir." Her mouth human enough for the shape to be familiar tilted. The others closed in a crescent behind her, all tall, all wearing versions of the same latticework armor. Each held their knot rifles not quite the same way. That said more to Yulin than most speeches could. The tall one gestured to herself, then to the stars, then touched the place over her heart 5 times, light quick taps. The projector spun characters again. The translator hunted and came up with Veshatar, Tarvan, 5-fold, Tarvan, Yulin repeated. The name was a shard from a briefing years ago, a word in a list of border systems that had not mattered until they did. The war had burned through Tarvan Prime like a scythe through grass. The guard called it a stabilizing action. The maps called it a change in jurisdiction. People called it whatever they could say without weeping. Vesha tilted her head toward his rifle. "Guard," the translator offered, then corrected itself, "Exiled guard." He wasn't sure if the stumble was the machine searching for a polite word or a moment, where an entirely different concept exiled as function, not status, had brushed past. He let it go. "You are being hunted," he said. He pointed to the sky. The projector caught up, sprinkled symbols, then sighed out the word pursuit in a voice that had learned it from traffic warnings. "And crime reports." Other figures stepped forward in turn. Vesha indicated each, tapping that same point over her chest with a different emphasis, as if making a chord. "Cyril Luth," the band on Julen's wrist translated when the second bowed. She had a healer's gear clipped along her left hip, tubes and vials that were all too empty. "Orcs," said the third, whose weapon's honeycomb glowed even at rest. Naya's soul, the fourth, smallest, eyes bright with a charge of fear and fury. The fifth came last, silent until she opened her palm and showed Yelena's scar like a starburst there. Tal Keth, the machine offered. Tal's gaze landed not on his face, but on his anchor spikes and lines, weighing methods, not man. They touched their chests again in sequence. 5 taps, 5 names, 5 survivors, 5 fewer husbands. The wind dipped. For a long breath they simply stood in it like statues on a drowned world. Yelen had been avoiding other beings for months. He felt the old steps of interaction creak under his boots. Then hold, inside, he said, tilting his head back toward the ridge. The storm would be doing its unpredictable dance with radio in another hour. And if the raiders decided to come back with friends, he preferred higher ground and a roof. He made the sign for shelter with both hands, a tent shape, something a child would understand. Vesh's shoulders lowered a fraction. She repeated the sign and motioned the others. They moved quickly, letting him lead, but never straying far from one another, reverent of a geometry that anchored them the way his lines anchored him. In the airlock he made space without thinking, stowed one pack beneath the bench, hung another on the clip he never used, silently assigned sections of the rack that had always felt excessive for one man. The 5 of them filed in with a practiced intimacy that made the small space feel generous. Helmets off, suits unlaced and folded along their own seams. Their faces were not all the same. Vesh's long, the bones fine. Syrah's rounder, eyes set wide. Oruan's mouth intent. Naya's gaze too quick. Tal's cheeks cut by too narrow scars. The silver of their skin wasn't uniform either. It shifted with angle and light, catching the storm's color and holding it for a breath before letting it go. They glanced at his shelves and screens the way professionals do in a stranger's cockpit, quick, respectful, assigning meaning without comment. Naya made a small noise when she saw the broken scout drone, and then a smaller noise when he saw her notice the noise she had made. He pretended not to. Water, Yelen said, setting a crate down. And heat. He found a 6th cup. Then a 7th when he remembered how Keeler 9 liked to make cups vanish if you did not watch them. Syrah's hands, ungloved now, drifted over the inside of the airlock door and paused at the shallow dents there. 5 of them in a gentle arc. He had put them there on a long night with a wrench and fury, as if making a constellation where there was none. Syrah pressed each in sequence, softly. Her voice, when she spoke, braided with the others until his translator could almost understand. 5 makes a ring. A ring holds. A ring grieves. He looked up at her. Widows, he said, and did not say I'm sorry, because there are condolences that are insults. Vesha stepped forward and unsealed a panel at her belt with 2 clean clicks. The compartment inside was not like a holster or pouch. It was too careful. She cupped something from it with both hands as if lifting it from water. Light poured into her palms and stayed. It was not actually fluid, not actually solid, but it made both sets of promises, a lattice of microfilaments that seemed to grow and ungrow before his eyes, tiny quick pulses running along them, slowing as they reached certain junctions, then leaping again. He could smell nothing. He could feel heat, but only in the way sunlight is hot, kind without being gentle. Vesha held it where they could all see, and they bowed their heads, not in worship but in report, like soldiers before a commander who knows too much. The light in her hands pulsed, 5, then 5 again. The point over her heart, where she had tapped her own name, glowed faintly in sympathy. This, the translator said, voice softened by uncertainty, is the core we carry. Orun opened her own belt and brought out a second lattice, smaller, pale as breath. Naya brought a 3rd and hit it again, quick, like a trick you don't yet know if you should show. Syrah's was the size of an egg. Tal did not open hers. She watched Yelen with her starburst scar turned toward him as if it could feel motive. The way skin feels heat. Elian stepped closer without meaning to. The lattices did something to space. He felt the air between his ribs open and close in a rhythm he did not own. He had seen experimental power plants that played with microsingularities. He had seen weapons that bent light until it forgot what it was. He had never seen anything that made him think of a city being born. Our husbands were keepers. Vesha said keepers delivered into his language from an origin that might have meant gardener. or priest or engineer, or simply one who lifts, of the living core. When the taking came for Tarvan, the great lattice was broken to be carried. It must be rejoined in a place of heat and depth, a vault, a vent. Her gaze flicked, once, to the thermal map on his wall that he never trusted, but always checked. We fled, she searched for a word, and the machine supplied one, with an apology baked into its tone. Made empty. We came here because this rock is full, but we were hunted, Yelen nodded, because he had seen the raiders. By whom? He asked. The translator tried pirates, and then choked on a better word. Vesha spared it. Proxies, she said. The empire you served hires hands to do what it does not wish to place on its ledgers. He did not argue. There are many books of war. Some have spines. Some are only app ledgers. He had been paid out of both. If you set the core here, Yelen said, pointing not at the glowing lattices, but at the vents marked in blue on the old miner's survey, you draw more than raiders. The guard has sensors built into half the rocks in the fringe. They'll feel a thing like this light their teeth. Tal's mouth twisted in what might have been agreement. Sarah put her lattice away as if tucking a child back into a bunk. Orun's weapon hummed a scale and fell still. We know, Vesha said. We sought a place where we could set it and defend it long enough for the shallow growth to take. Once a seed echoes itself, it hides. This is our doctrine. But we are not soldiers. Yelen looked at the 5 of them, at their weapons that worked only as a 5-fold instrument, at the way they had flown together even while one craft died, at the way no one had said the names of the dead since entering his air. He knew soldiers in a dozen kinds. He knew religion too. This was both and neither. Why me? He asked, though he had already heard their answer in the way they had looked at his rifle and his spikes, and the dents in his airlock. There are other rocks, other men with guns, Naya answered, unexpectedly. Her voice was thinner than Vesha's, higher, like blown glass. Because you didn't shoot first. Because you anchored yourself to the ground when the sky told you to float. Because you warned us when you could have hidden. Because the Empire calls you exile and we call that word a door. There are 5 reasons. It is enough, 5 again. He hated the way that melted him. He loved it too. He did not say that. Instead, he reached and turned the weather map up, then the thermal register, then a miner's survey so old it had the guard's logo in a corner like a stain. Lines crawled up the screen like the memory of a planet. He was moving before he decided to, pulling hard copy from a drawer, laying it on the table, weighting it with a wrench, a cup, a bolt. Vesha brought her projector over and overlaid a delicate web of her own above it, a transparent dome, in which their 5 lattices, represented as glowing beads, could be moved across the terrain like God's moving cities. That ridge shelters you from 3 out of 4 wind vectors, Yelen said. But it also channels charge, good for shooting, terrible for living. The drill shafts here. He stabbed a finger at a cluster of black rectangles. Connect to the main vent field by these old service ducts. They won't take a person, not without a fight, but they'll carry heat. If we had time, we could wake one and make it sing, then feed your core slowly, spread it in the basalt like roots. The sensors might think it's old machinery rolling over. If we do not have time? Tal asked. Her eyes did not leave his hands. Then we choose a vent. The guard already overestimates this one. Here, he tapped a circle that the miner's survey called 7KEL. Dumpin' heat. Dumpin' signal. Make it look like an old extractor waking up and choking on its own throat. They will come to swat it back down. We make our reel set 3 kilometers off, in the shadow zone of their attention. Shadow zone. Sarah repeated, tasting the phrase like medicine. For grief, we used to go. She stopped. Words broke differently in other species. She folded her hands and let the rest go. Vesha did not ask for guarantees. She traced a line in the air that matched his finger's path on the paper, and the projector drew their 2 maps together until they hummed in a rough unison. We will set the core in the shadow, she said. We will build it just enough to live, to hide, to remember, to become. Orun added, soft, as if quoting. Then you will leave, Yelen said. He did not make it a question. If you stay, the guard will take you at scale, not with proxies. They do not forgive people who prove their sensors fallible. Vesha's mouth made the movement again. Not a smile. Something older. If we live, she said, we will carry a word from this rock. That word will make others brave in places you will never see. It was a silly thing. How fast the room felt to warm. Jalen looked at the five of them, then at the rifle on the wall and the broken drone on his bench, and the dents he'd punched in the door on a bad night. He had been very careful not to say we for months. The word had cut him before, and he had never stopped bleeding. He found it anyway, lying where he had left it. We'll need charges for the decoy, he said, and anchors along the duct floors. The wind will try to take us, and the storm will try to bless us, and both will just kill us. If we let them, we'll need a route that isn't a straight line from anything to anything. 5 routes, Tal said. Deadpan. 1 for each of us. Yelen snorted despite himself. 2, he said. Primary and fallback. More than that, and we spend all our planning breath on a geometry. The storm will rewrite in 5 minutes. Vesha reached out as if to touch his shoulder, then let her hand settle on the map instead. You will help us, she said, and it was not a question. It was the kind of sentence you say when the alternative has no grammar. He found the part of himself that wanted to argue down into its chair. I'll get you through the first hour, he said, knowing there's no such thing as only the first hour. After that, we move the map, the storm. Polite for a moment, let the bunker hold its silence. Sira turned and, without asking, began to make his kettle sing. Orun checked the seals on their suits with fingers as sure as a gunsmith's. Naya crouched before the broken drone and raised her hands, not to fix, but to understand why he hadn't. Tal crossed to the weapons locker, looked away with the contained scorn of a professional considering hobbyist gear. Vesha stood beside Yelen and watched his weather map throb in untrustworthy colors. You have been alone, she said without translation. Some meanings climb into your ear without machinery. You are not now. He did not look at her in case he nodded hard enough to be a different kind of man. Instead, he pointed to the miner's schematic again and moved a bolt 3 fingers to the left to Marka. Place where heat lay like sleeping embers. We set the decoy here, he said, voice steady. We seed the shadow here, and we pray the Empire's teeth are busy somewhere else. The Empire does not pray, Vesha said. Then we make them busy, Yelen answered. Vesha tapped her chest 5 times, once for each of them, then once more, lightly, as if acknowledging a new number in the ring. The map looked wrong in the morning. Of course, there was no morning on Keeler 9, just a lull in the storm, when the thunder receded to a dull heartbeat, and the ash light from the system's red star seeped through the clouds like wine through cloth. But Yelen Reese had learned to call these lulls mornings. It gave him an anchor, and anchors kept you sane. The widows of Tarvin Prime sat cross-legged on the floor, their lattice weapons laid in a circle round the faint glow of the cores they carried. The light bled against the metal walls, painting them in hues Yelen couldn't name, colors that lived between colors. They were humming 5 notes, weaving together in a way that prickled against his chest. He'd heard soldiers sing before battle, engineers chant to keep rhythm while hoisting cannon. But this was not song. It was a kind of code, half prayer, half calculation. He wanted to hate it, wanted to block his ears and return to the silence that had been his refuge for months. Instead, he found himself lingering in the doorway, rifle across his back, staring at them until Tal caught his gaze and broke the hum with a sharp look. You walk like a soldier still, she said, her translator stumbling but close enough. I was a soldier, Yelen replied. Now I'm nothing. Nothing does not carry rifles, Tal answered. Her voice was flat, but the scar in her palm pulsed faintly, like it disagreed with her tone. Vesha rose gracefully and crossed to the map table. The storm's lull made the projector clearer, her web of light overlaying Jalen's old survey like a second skeleton. She didn't look at him when she spoke. We must move soon. The proxies will come back. When they do, they will not bring 5. They will bring 20 or 50, and behind them your Empire's guard. The word guard cut like shrapnel. He almost said not my Empire anymore, but the lie stuck. He had worn the uniform, ordered the shots, trained men who never came home. His exile didn't erase that. Instead, he said, if the guard comes, nothing on this rock will save you. Sira, The healer looked up from checking her dwindling vials. "We know. That is why we need you before they come." The room quieted. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if to let the sentence hang. Yelen felt his throat dry. "Why me? Because I know their tricks? Because I used to be one of them?" "No," Vesha said. "Because you refused to be one of them when it mattered." He flinched. The tribunal's words echoed in his skull dereliction, insubordination, exile. They had made his disobedience sound like cowardice, not conviction. And now these 5 widows, survivors of a war the Empire barely admitted existed, told him that his worst wound was his greatest worth. He paced the bunker, boots heavy against metal. "You don't understand. I tried saving civilians once. I lost everything for it. I'm not going to play savior again just to watch the Empire grind you into ash." Orun, who rarely spoke, tilted her head. "And if you walk away, what happens to us? To the core?" Yelen stopped pacing. He saw it too vividly, the 5 of them dragged from their ships by raiders, their glowing cores smashed under armored boots, the guard writing another report about containment of hostile contraband, another silent genocide hidden under numbers. His hands clenched. He hated how easily the old instincts returned the way his mind calculated defensive lines, fallback routes, choke points. It was like an old song you thought you'd forgotten but still knew by heart. "You don't need me." He tried again. "You've survived this long." Naya, the youngest, met his gaze with unblinking prism eyes. "We survived because we ran. There's no more running." The hum of the cores deepened, as if agreeing. Yelen felt it in his ribs, like a second heartbeat syncing with his own. He looked at their faces, grief carved into each, yet steady, unwilling to break. Widows, yes, but not broken. He sat heavily on the bench by the wall, hands on his knees. "If I help you," he said slowly, "I become a soldier again. And I swore I'd never be that man." Vesha finally looked at him. Her prism eyes were calm but sharp. "Perhaps you swore wrong." The hours that followed blurred into training. Yelen cursed himself for it even as he drilled them. But soldiers teach, that's what they do. He showed them how to anchor lines against the storm, how to fire in rotation rather than all at once, how to set traps with the monofilament spikes. He sketched kill zones in dust on the floor, made them rehearse covering one another's flanks. At first, their movements were ritualistic, to bound to the 5-fold harmony of their weapons. But under his guidance they loosened, adapted, learned how to fight like soldiers instead of only as keepers. Tal picked up his corrections fastest, her scarred palm steady on the trigger. Naya was eager, too eager, rushing ahead until he barked at her to slow down. Cyril learned to blend her healer's tools with combat patching seals mid-fight, throwing vials that burst into blinding vapor. Orun's aim was flawless, and Vesha moved like water, always where she was needed most, when they collapsed. Breath steaming in the cold air of the bunker, Yelen realized he had stopped saying you and started saying we. Later, when the widows slept in a huddle by the glow of their lattices, Yelen sat alone at the viewport. The storm raged outside, lightning vining the plains. He rested the rifle across his lap and stared into the bruise-colored horizon. His chest felt split. One half wanted to vanish again into silence, to let the widows carry their doomed mission alone. The other half it was awake now, restless, demanding. He had buried it after exile, but training them had dug it up. He remembered the tribunal chamber. His own voice, hoarse but steady. "We do not fire on civilians." He had lost everything for that sentence. But now, looking at 5 alien widows clutching the last hope of their people, he wondered if exile had been less punishment and more preparation. Damn it, he muttered into the storm. His reflection in the viewport looked back, gaunt, eyes hollow but burning again. He knew his decision before he spoke it aloud. "I'll fight." The storm cracked open with thunder, as if sealing his vow. Behind him, Vesha stirred in her sleep, her lips moving soundlessly. 5 taps of her hand brushed against her chest, even in dreaming, and Yelen Reese, exiled soldier, felt the weight of silence lift. Yelen Reese stood on the rim of the fissure, anchor line biting into his waist, rifle braced against the basalt, his visor filled with signatures 30 Raider craft on approach, the drives burning hot enough to leave scars on the sensors, and behind them, heavier echoes. Guard hulls, warships. "They're here," he said into the calm bead dot in the cavern below. The widows of Tarvin Prime stood around the vent shaft, their 5 cores glowing like stars caught in their palms. The light spilled upward, painting the basalt walls with shifting prisms. Vesha lifted her head as if she'd heard his voice even without the comms. Her eyes caught the light and threw it back at him in a dozen colors. "We are ready," she answered. "Are you?" He almost laughed. He had been born ready, trained ready, broken for being ready. Now he was ready again. The irony cut like glass, but he welcomed the pain. It kept him sharp. The first wave came fast. Too fast. The raiders dropped through the storm with guns already spitting fire. Plasma bolts hammered the ridge where Yelen crouched. He slammed a spike into the rock, clipped himself, and returned fire. His first shot tore a raider's stabilizer apart, sending it cartwheeling into the fissure. Shadows. He barked. That was the signal. The widows fired as one, 5 arcs of light weaving into a single spear that stabbed upward. Another raider exploded in a blossom of fractured metal. The storm itself became their ally. Lightning leapt from cloud to basalt, caught on the charges Yelen had planted earlier, and arched straight into the raiders' underbellies. One ship simply folded in half, its scream cut short by the gale. But for every kill, 2 more ships appeared. The guards' proxies were not skilled, but they were many inside the cavern. Sira and Naya carried their cores to the shaft and lowered them into the vent. The basalt shuddered as the cores met the ancient heat of Keeler 9. Steam roared upward, and the cavern filled with a smell like scorched stone and rain. The lattice light pulsed, sensing with the rhythm of the vent. "It accepts them," Sira whispered. Awe in her voice. "Not yet," Orun warned. Her weapon hummed at her side. "We must hold until the seed echoes." Vesha placed her palm on the rim of the vent. "Then we hold." Yelen fell back from the ridge as 2 raiders skimmed low, strafing fire chewing into the rock. He vaulted into the cavern, rolled, and came up beside Tal, who covered the entrance with precise bursts from her weapon. "Fall back line," he ordered. "Draw them in close. The storm won't follow them inside." Tal grunted approval and shifted her aim. The others tightened their circle round the vent. The cores pulsed brighter now, throwing shadows that danced across their silver skin. The first raiders burst through the cavern mouth. Yelen shot one in the chest, dropping him mid-stride. Tal's light lance carved another in half. The widow's formation held, but then the guard arrived. Heavy boots struck basalt. Armor gleamed in the lattice glow. These weren't proxies. These were soldiers Yelen had once trained with, once commanded. Their visors were blank, their rifles identical to the one in his hands. The sight hollowed him, but he had no time for regret. The guard opened fire. The cavern erupted. Bolts cracked into stone, showering shards. One clipped Jalen's shoulder. Alarms screamed in his suit, but he kept firing. He dropped a guard trooper with a headshot, then another with a shot to the knee. He moved like the old days, fast, precise, brutal. The widows fought as one. Their weapons' honeycombs blazed, and when they fired together, the light wasn't just destructive, it was beautiful. Spears of radiance stitched through guard ranks, cutting them down in brilliant arcs. Sira knelt to patch Naya's bleeding arm without missing a beat. Orun reloaded so quickly it looked like sleight of hand. Tal never wasted a shot. Vesha stood tall in the center, voice rising in that strange, layered hum. The cores answered her, their pulses climbing in tempo, the vent glowing brighter with each beat. "Almost," she called. "Hold them a little longer." Jalen's magazine clicked empty. He slammed in a new one with bloody fingers. His mind raced, measuring angles, counting bodies. They couldn't hold much longer. For every guard trooper they dropped, another pushed forward. The Empire's teeth were endless. "Vesha," he shouted. "How long?" "Until it sings," she replied, calm even as fire lit the air around her. A grenade bounced into the circle. Yelen Dove scooped it, hurled it back. The blast rocked the cavern, deafening him, but the widows kept standing. Smoke choked the air. Through it, he saw the guard commander push forward, a heavy exosuit making him a walking tank. His rifle spat red fire. Yelen knew that man. Corundal, a commander from his own unit. The man who had given the order Yelen once refused. Fire on civilians. Their eyes met through smoke and visor glass. Recognition flared. Hatred followed. Rhys, Corrin's voice crackled over comms. Still alive? Still betraying your own? Yelen rose, rifle steady. Still murdering innocents? They opened fire at the same time. Bolts tore into basalt. Yelen rolled, firing as he moved, hitting joints in the exosuit. Sparks flew, but Corrin advanced inexorably, a juggernaut. Tal joined Yelen, her light lance raking the exosuit's armor. But even that couldn't break it fast enough. Then the widow's hum rose into a scream. The 5 of them raised their weapons together, lattices blazing brighter than lightning. They fired as one, and their beams fused into a single lance of pure brilliance. It struck Corrin square in the chest. The exosuit convulsed, screamed, and shattered. The commander vanished in a spray of molten steel and ash. The cavern shook, not from the blast but from the vent. The cores had awakened. The shaft roared with light, a living lattice of energy climbing upward like vines of fire. The widows cried out, their voices braided, carrying grief and hope in equal measure. The light pulsed 5, then 5 again, then multiplied until the cavern walls themselves seemed to glow. The guard froze. Some turned and fled. Others tried to fire again, but their weapons flickered uselessly in the rising hum. The cores had found their echo. Vesha looked at Yelen, her eyes burning with 1,000 colors. It is done. We are seated. The vent exploded upward, a pillar of radiant force punching into the storm above. The sky split open, lightning swallowed by the lattice light. The raiders scattered. The guard ships faltered, their systems buckling under the surge. Keeler 9 had become a beacon. When the storm cleared, silence fell. The guard had retreated, broken. The raiders were gone. Only wreckage and bodies remained. The widows knelt around the vent, their faces wet with tears that shimmered like mercury. The cores no longer pulsed in their hands, they pulsed in the rock itself, in the moon's bones. The seed had taken root. Elian stood among them, rifle dangling at his side, chest heaving. He had fought harder than he ever had before, not for an empire, not for orders, but for something worth protecting. You've won, he said hoarsely. No, Vesha corrected gently. We have begun. Syrah placed a hand on his arm, light and warm. And you, Yelen Rhys, are not nothing. He wanted to argue, to retreat into silence. But when he looked at them, the 5 widows, who had lost everything, yet still carried hope, he couldn't. For the first time in years, he let himself believe. The storm rumbled again, softer this time, as if the moon itself approved. And the exiled soldier, who had once hidden in silence, stood tall, no longer alone.